Thank you, Minister. And together we have you until around 11:30 to respond to questions. Okay, thank you. And we'll begin the questions with the Deputy Chair of the Committee, Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Minister for appearing here today. The Minister quoted a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, but also the Minister could go to Solvay versus the Attorney General, a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada. Of more recent vintage, a couple of months ago, the British Columbia Court of Appeal in Henry versus the Chief Electoral Officer concerning changes made to the Elections Act in 2007 and 1997 as far as voter identification is concerned at the polling booth. And the position of the Government of Canada at that time was, and I'll quote to you paragraph 352 of the Henry versus Canada case. It says this, just one sentence. The third option that satisfies the identification requirements is vouching. Canada argues that this procedure provides greater accessibility and a fail-safe measure because it enables those without acceptable identification to cast a ballot if vouched for by another elector. In other words, the Government of Canada was arguing their fail-safe for bringing in voter identification documents. Their fail-safe was vouching. And because of that, the Election Act portions were upheld by the court. And that's Henry versus the Chief Electoral Officer, who was denying such negativity in the changes. We now have the Chief Electoral Officer appearing before a House committee saying there's going to be tens of thousands of people who will be denied their right to vote. Section 3 of the Charter says every citizen of Canada has a right to vote in an election of members of the House of Commons or of a legislative assembly and to be qualified for membership therein. And I don't think that can be overruled by the notwithstanding clause. It's excluded. Yes. So my question to you is this. With such overwhelming evidence on a balance of probabilities, that's how a charter violation is established, not beyond a reasonable doubt. We have the Chief Electoral Officer, the person you've assigned to enforce this bill, saying tens of thousands of people will lose their right to vote. The Department of Justice normally approves a bill before it goes to the House as to its constitutionality. Why did the Department of Justice approve its constitutionality in this case, and how do you respond to tens of thousands of people who will not be able to vote?
Well, I don't accept that. We have here, I have with me the list of the 39 options that people can use to identify themselves. It's worth noting that unlike in many U.S. states, in Canada you are not required to use photo ID or government-issued ID to identify yourself. There is a diverse list of 39 different forms of ID, of which 13 contain an address. One need only provide 2 of these 39, one having an address, or a government-issued photo identification in order to identify oneself. Now, I think it's important to examine what is on this list because, you know, our attention turns to people who we might think have difficulty possessing traditional photo identification. So, a certificate of Indian status, often known as a status card, is allowed. A medical card clinic, a hospital bracelet, a library card, a Veterans Affairs Canada health card, a Canadian National Institute for the Blind card, which, by the way, in many cases contains an address, and I think it should be recognized by Elections Canada in those instances as proof of address. There's also correspondence or a letter of attestation from an Indian band or a student residence or a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter. These provide a cornucopia of different opportunities for Canadians to demonstrate who they are and where they live when they cast their ballot.
The Chief Electoral Officer, however, gave different examples in proving his point. Two senior citizens living together. Only one of them receives the mail. He highlighted other instances of persons who were in long-term care facilities, in which the administrator today refuses to issue his attestation letters. Refuses. No law can force him to do it. The Elections Act doesn't force him to do it. Just refuses to do it. Students who don't have that present permanent address or can't show it. Any number of instances that he outlined to your House of Commons committee provides ample evidence that on a balance of probabilities, he's right that tens of thousands of people will not be able to vote.
I think we're better served to speak in specifics rather than broad strokes. So let's deal with the cases that you've presented. First of all, let's deal with seniors. They would be eligible for old age security if they're over 65.
Yes.
And an old age security statement, which comes in the mail regularly, would contain that information. So would the check, which is also on the list of 39. As for students, they are allowed to use their student ID card. They are also allowed to use a letter from the residence they live in, should they reside on campus. So you've given two examples. I've given you two responses of how they would be served.
That wouldn't cover all.
Minister, thank you very much. As you correctly pointed out, there has been a lot of debate on this issue, many people objecting. I would like to read to you something that was written in an editorial in the Globe and Mail, if you could respond. The Harper government's continued focus on the threat of voter fraud in federal elections is approaching absurdity. Everyone with any expertise who has examined the question in detail has arrived at the same conclusion. There is no threat. I wonder if you can respond to this idea that we have no voter fraud in Canada, that it's absurd for the Fair Elections Act to try and tackle the issue.
Well, there are a couple of things I'll say. First of all, when you don't check, you don't know. In the last election, there were 50,735 irregularities linked to vouching. Now, no one is suggesting that each and every one of those cases involved fraud. However, the rules exist as, quote, safeguards. According to Elections Canada, those are the safeguards against fraud. And when those safeguards are violated 50,735 times, there's the opportunity for fraud. In 45,000 cases in the last election, Elections Canada did not keep records of who the voter and the voucher were. How is it possible to confirm if someone voted more than once or was vouched for more than once if there's no record of who these people are? Now, 45,000 is not a small number. It is out of a total of 120,000. So we're talking about roughly a third of all instances where vouching was used in the last election. I think Elections Canada's testimony on this point has further strengthened my resolve to require some form of ID, because the CEO has simply dismissed these massive numbers of irregularities as irrelevant and unimportant, which suggests he has no plan to deal with them. And therefore, I think that I'm more convinced than I was before. And I should say that the response on the ground from everyday Canadians has been very strong. They believe that ID should be required. And if I could just address something else. The Globe and Mail said something very interesting in an editorial just the other day. I think it was Mr. Yakubuski, Conrad Yakubuski. He was talking about U.S. voting requirements, and he made the comparison between those there and here. Beyond the fact that the comparison is absurd, because in American states they're requiring photo ID and we're not, he actually pointed to one state which is removing an advance voting day as an example of what he considered to be U.S. voter suppression. The Fair Elections Act adds a voting day. So not only are we not pursuing the policies that he criticized in the United States, we are doing precisely the opposite. And we are making it easier for people to vote in this country by giving them an extra day and requiring Elections Canada advertise what those advance voting days are.
For those people who are willing to acknowledge that having a third of voucher ballots that potentially contain fraud is a serious problem. Some would then say, okay, so why didn't you try and fix vouching?
We think it's reasonable to expect that people present some ID when they cast their ballot. We require people present some ID when they exercise their constitutionally entrenched right to cross the border. We require people present ID for all sorts of basic entitlements that exist in society and are furnished by government. And we think that it's a reasonable responsibility for people to select from the 39 different options available under the existing system to cast their ballot.